All right, everyone. Hello. This is Raymond Flowchat from mxdwn.com. That's Mixdown. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to episode 42 of This Week is Live. We can hardly believe it either. It's been 42 episodes, just about a year of being on the air with this show. We have a whole bunch of fun stories for you today, so we're going to dive right in. The first of which is going to start in the realm of video games. Now, we often have stories from around the map of entertainment and everything that we cover, music and movies and television as well, but today, kind of bubbling up over the last few days, is a really interesting and on some level unfortunate, but also kind of exciting series of stories that probably nobody would have known otherwise. Now, we brought you reporting in the past about how Microsoft, the parent company that is, for all points and purposes, Xbox, has been, along with all the other major AAA video game companies, kind of in acquiring mode, right? Like there's a big fight for first party content. Sony, PlayStation kind of running everything. And so, in some level, Nintendo too, having really excellent first party software that they don't have to share with other video game companies. So they have it as what's called an exclusive if you're not much of a gamer or a gaming fan. And, amidst things like Double Fine and then Bethesda, ultimately Microsoft has kind of been in their own buying spree, and one of the big things was going to be their acquisition of Activision Blizzard, which is a massive video game conglomerate, and Blizzard itself is one of the biggest video game creators there is in the world at this point. Now, this attempt has to meet scrutiny at a regulatory level. That's very common here in America and the United Kingdom. You can't just buy any random company and just be, Bob's your uncle, it's okay. One of the big pieces of this, and it usually comes down to a group called the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, or certain times, depending on how big the case was, kind of like when Microsoft Windows was being subject to antitrust litigation back in the 90s, the Department of Justice. Now, this was kind of a standard part of the process, and there's been a kind of a protracted legal fight that's been bubbling through various stages of the legal system. Now, there was already a lot of kind of drama in the United Kingdom and the equivalent of the FTC over there, but then more recently, the FTC here in the United States had attempted to file for an injunction against this. They had put forth a temporary restraining order wanting the acquisition of Activision Blizzard to not come through. And this happened earlier this year in June. Now, it looked like that wasn't going to work out for the FTC. The judge presiding over the case, Jacqueline Scott Corley, denied the injunction. And then in July, the FTC announced that they were going to pull the effort to have the injunction put on it. So it looked like, for all points and purposes, that this acquisition of Activision Blizzard was going to go through, and Xbox was going to take one of the largest gaming companies and bring it under its own net and its own tent. And what's interesting about all of this, as this has been kind of working its way through the legal system, apparently there was kind of just a massive kind of accident. Now, when things are going through, the court process, there's different pieces of it. Some of that has to do with filing public motions, and then there's systems where these motions are cataloged, such as Pacer. But then there is also just different kinds of document discovery, evidence that's being provided across different legal teams, and where it was found and who leaked it, who knows, but it's kind of a big oopsie, which is that there was a pretty large document that detailed a ton of very private confidential information on behalf of Microsoft and Xbox, and somebody found it. Apparently, according to Tom Warren from The Verge, it was attached into a very long PDF and attempted to be hidden, but actually posted publicly online. And of course, it was consumed, and now the information's everywhere. And it got all the way around the internet in a matter of seconds. And amidst these things were several very interesting things about what Xbox and Microsoft kind of had planned, or other things they might have done. And we're not going to go into deep detail for this, in case you're someone who's maybe not a gaming fan. But a lot of really, really fascinating things. And I mean, it kind of speaks to this overarching industry thing where the major video game console makers are in a really kind of nasty dogfight for market share, right? They're trying to edge out the competitors and trying to, the video game industry is bigger than the movie industry. Everybody tries to ignore that. It's kind of like how soccer or football, as it's known in the rest of the world, is actually the world's biggest sport, but most people act like it isn't for some reason. It's one of those weird blinders of pop culture and major media entertainment. And, there's billions of dollars on the line. So winning the fight for the console wars obviously means a tremendous amount of money, especially if you're a publicly traded company like Microsoft. So, amidst the many, many different things that came out as a part of this alleged leak, and who knows how this happened, if it was an accident, if somebody leaked this information on purpose, but amidst the many things that were a part of this leak of information, first and foremost, that Xbox is working on a new version of Xbox Series X, which would be a diskless hybrid game system. This is going to become more and more common in the years to come. I mean, those of us that are a little older have the concept of a video game system being there's a cartridge or a disc or a DVD or a Blu-ray or whatever, and that's where the game would basically be put on. But more and more nowadays, almost everything is done on demand, downloadable, or streaming completely. So apparently there's something of that they've been at least thinking about. The CEO, Phil Spencer, is apparently, this is a second thing, apparently still aggressively kind of thinking they want to purchase all of Nintendo. Now that strikes me as kind of nuts. I don't even know how that would happen. And I mean, imagine the copyright and the creative intellectual property, the merchandising, I mean, everything that is Nintendo, and how much that would how much would that cost? I mean, there were so many headlines about what Elon Musk paid to purchase Twitter, which he is now somewhat dumbly rebranded as X. Can you even imagine what it would cost to buy Nintendo? But apparently, the CEO of Xbox, Phil Spencer, very badly wants it, and is still actively thinking of it. There's no indication that Nintendo is seriously considering that offer, but fascinating to know that they would try to gobble up one of the major other video game makers as a whole. I can't even imagine how much money that would cost, or if even Microsoft would be willing to pay it if it came down to it. Apparently, in addition to that, they also were interested in buying another major game distributor, ZeniMax Games. Also fascinating to me because it's just such different kind of content. There's apparently serious consideration, not saying that there was a deal on the table or that this happened, but there was serious consideration that they wanted to purchase WB Games, which is Warner Brothers Games. And those of you may not know it, Warner Brothers, which is obviously the giant television and movie studio conglomerate, they have an interactive department. They make many video games all the time, every year. In addition to that, there's also some news about titles that video games specifically that were going to come out or may still come out. One was in a remaster of Oblivion. Another was a remaster of Fallout 3. Apparently, there were plans for a Dishonored 3 on the catalog. And lastly, but not leastly, Elder Scrolls 6, which is a very popular franchise in the world of games, going to not be on PlayStation at all. Something that typically would have been a cross-platform game. And this is obviously going back to the front of this entire topic. A big part of the reason that these acquisitions and this discussion is happening in the first place was to try to create more first-party content that is exclusive to their own platforms. That's where, the money is. The more first-party titles that you have, the better first-party titles you have, the more consoles you're ultimately going to sell. Elsewhere in the world of music and in, quite frankly, just incredibly dunderheaded happenings, many of you who do not obsessively follow the world of music will probably not know this name. It's Jann Wenner. Jann Wenner has been, the leader and original co-founder of the famed Rolling Stone magazine. Has not been a part of the magazine for numerous years, and since 2019, and now apparently the magazine being run by his son Gus, but he hasn't directly been involved. But Jann Wenner was known as kind of the architect of everything that magazine became, and in the realms of music to this day, way too many people and too many managers still treat it like that's the most important piece of press you can because of the prestige and the fame and the glory of it all. I don't even know how many average music fans in this arena even read Rolling Stone. I mean, if I were a band manager or a publicist, I wouldn't really be thinking that's the apotheosis of prime coverage, but that's how people tend to do things. Well, Jann Wenner, having, kind of not longer being involved anymore, has a book that he's on a book tour and he's been publicizing. And the book is called The Masters, and it focuses on interviews he did, some only in their lifetime before they passed away, obviously, with some luminary heroes in the world of rock and folk music. And those particular artists are Bono from U2, Bob Dylan, Jerry Garcia, the late singer-guitar player from the Grateful Dead, Mick Jagger, John Lennon, obviously the late John Lennon, Bruce Springsteen, and Pete Townsend. Now, this is somewhat obviously like the kinds of people that he has spent his whole adult life covering and loving and fawning over with his magazine. That seems pretty standard in that respect. But then when a part of press coverage kind of stating the mission statement of this is like the all-time masters of music, Jann Wenner was kind of pressed as to why there were no women and there were no non-white singers. And his answers were kind of the facepalm variety in terms of his justification for that. It could have been easy enough to just say, these are the artists that I just happen to like best. So it wasn't me trying to say these are the best of all time. And that's a dubious thing, right? Like I get into arguments with people a lot because I'll often say if Randy Rhoads, the guitar player for Ozzy Osbourne, had lived, he'd be the best guitar player that ever lived. But that's tough because there was only really 2 records that he ever played on, Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman. And of course, depending on how you look at it, the original Quiet Riot bootlegs. So it's kind of hard to handicap, would he truly have been the best guitar player that ever lived? I personally think so, but it's hard to make that statement from this is the master of guitar. Well, in terms of these masters of music and his justification of it, he had the following to say: the people had to meet a couple criteria, but it was just kind of my personal interest and love of them. Insofar as the women, just none of them were as articulate enough on this intellectual level. It's not that they're not creative geniuses. It's not that they're inarticulate, although go have a deep conversation with Grace Slick or Janis Joplin. Please be my guest. That doesn't make any sense at all. Janis Joplin having been gone so long. You know, Joni, meaning Joni Mitchell, one of the legends of American folk music, was not a philosopher of rock and roll. She didn't, in my mind, meet that test. Not by her work, not by other interviews she did. The people I interviewed were the kind of philosophers of rock. Of black artists, you know, Stevie Wonder, genius, right? I suppose when you use a word as broad as masters, the fault is using that word. Maybe Marvin Gaye or Curtis Mayfield. I mean, they just didn't articulate at that level. Well, no real surprise. The pushback was immense and in an incredibly diverse time. Swift, let's just say it that way. And people were not happy, and it's kind of a ridiculous assertion. I don't know. I mean, Rolling Stone's been covering Aretha Franklin for decades. Seems pretty obvious to me. I mean, I don't know. it's a curious choice to be sure. And of course, the reprisal was swift. People were angered by the rhetoric, the notion that there wasn't anyone in how many decades of, you know, popular music since the record era of music, you know, stretching back roughly 100 years, maybe 120 years, you know, ago. That's it. Not one woman, not one non-white person. So in the aftermath of this, Jann Wenner has been straight up removed from the board of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which he was a founder. So the board has just, this does not reflect with their values. You're out. He's no longer on the board of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And then shortly after that, the magazine which he ran for such a long time, Rolling Stone issued a statement and said, Jann Wenner's recent statement in the New York Times do not represent the value and practices of today's Rolling Stone. Jann Wenner has not been directly involved in our operations since 2019. Our purpose, especially in his departure, has been to tell stories that reflect the diversity of voices and experiences that shape our world. At Rolling Stone's core is the understanding that music above all can bring us together, not divide us. Ouch. And then, of course, the requisite mea culpa followed, which is his own statement recognizing the mistake, where he said, "The Masters is a collection of interviews I've done over the years that seemed to me to best represent an idea of rock and roll's impact on my world. They were not meant to represent the whole of music and its diverse and important originators, but to reflect the high points of my career. Interviews I felt illustrated the breadth and experience in that career. They don't reflect my appreciation and admiration for myriad totemic, world-changing artists whose music and ideas I revere, and I will celebrate and promote as long as I live. I totally understand the inflammatory nature of badly chosen words and deeply apologize and accept the consequences." Moving right along. Now, we talked to you a bit last week about how Drew Barrymore and Bill Maher, for their respective shows, the Drew Barrymore Show, which kind of news to me that that's been a thing for several seasons, and then, of course, the venerable Real Time with Bill Maher, and that they were going to return those shows to the air. They each had their own kind of reasons and their whole argument. And this is, of course, in the wake of the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes that are happening, most pertinently to these shows, because these don't usually use acting talent of any kind. These are talk shows. Writers, though, because they're usually scripted segments and or comedy. especially in the case of Real Time with Bill Maher, where numerous sections of that show were, were and always have been scripted comedy. And they had their own reasonings. Bill Maher's was kind of based on there's a whole ton of people who work on this show who are not writers and are not actors or, any kind of like prepared acting. And none of them can work or make money right now. And so he wanted to bring the show back to the air without any scripted content. Same thing with Drew Barrymore. And once again, a very quick pushback and reprisal on that. Admittedly, kind of a murky area, like doesn't necessarily mean that they're breaking the terms of, breaking the strike. They're not hiring scab labor. They're not going against the unions. But most people looked at it as a move in bad faith, right? People out here are, not able to work, not able to make money. Companies are grinding to a halt, probably losing a ton of money. There's a big kind of discord between what is acceptable and what will happen and what will work. It was kind of looked at as in bad taste. Well, both of them have reversed course, and neither of those shows are coming back to the air as was originally stated. Okay. Now, in the case of Drew Barrymore, her statement was, "I have listened to everyone, and I am making the decision to pause the show's premiere until the strike is over. I have no words to express my deepest apologies to anyone I have hurt, and of course, to our incredible team who works on the show and has made it what it is today. We really tried to find our way forward, and I really, truly hope for resolution for the entire industry very soon." Bill Maher, on the other hand, indicated, "My decision to return to work was made when it seemed nothing was happening, and there was no end in sight to the strike. Now that both sides have agreed to go back to the negotiating table, I'm going to delay the return of real time for now and hope they can finally get this done." Now, if nothing else, you can see this as what is inevitable in terms of a long protracted strike like this. I mean, a massive section of this country lives on entertainment. People don't go outside like they did in the 50s. Like, this is the world of people watching shows or movies all the time. And of course, a lot of people make their living making shows and movies. And that tension is only going to increase as the months go on and shows are completely exhausted and movies run out. And of course, people's livelihoods, their ability to make rent, their ability to pay their mortgage or buy groceries, take care of their families starts to become exacerbated. It's only going to get more intense like this. And this is just kind of the beginning of that. And we'll keep you posted as there is developments. And of course, every few days there's talk of discussions happening and things and negotiations, but there's nothing firm or concrete being presented right now as an arrangement that works. And of course, even if it does, the guilds and the unions have to vote for it. Will they or won't they? We won't know until those terms are announced. Elsewhere, in kind of darker news and kind of unavoidable at this point, you probably have already heard the famed actor and comedian Russell Brand has been accused of alleged sexual assault by 4 different women, and to boot, an additional case of alleged rape. Now, there's not a ton of details about this or the accusers. This information strictly comes from various British news organizations that have been investigating this. And typically when this kinds of thing happens, the women are not going forward, indicating who they are, and their details we just don't have at this point in terms of understanding, did this or did this not happen. This is a kind of thing that's going to play out over a long stretch of time. But of course, as in the matter of the Me Too era of anything of this kind and this variety, the ramifications are basically immediate. Now, Russell Brand, as soon as this kind of broke, went on Instagram and issued his own statement where he said, "Amidst this litany of astonishing, rather baroque attacks are some very serious allegations that I absolutely refute." So there is his initial denial. And now the ramifications of that are already starting to play out. And there was a tour that he was engaged in that was, is one of his many comedy tours, because he's, as many times as he's done movies or TV shows, he very often does very successful comedy tours where he kind of speaks on philosophy and the other different kinds of things he believes. And then that had the plug pulled on it completely. There was a venue called the Theatre Royal Windsor where many of his comedy dates were scheduled as the tour was going on. And they said, "We don't like doing it, but we know you'll understand," as they canceled the remainder of his shows there. And the rest of his tour now delayed indefinitely in the wake of these allegations. And then, as kind of a extra added layer to this, London's police force issued this statement. They received a report of a sexual assault which was alleged to have taken place in Soho in central London in 2003. The custom for British forces to never reveal the identity of a single subject giving the complaint. It came in response to inquiries revolving around brand. We'll keep you posted as more information comes to light, but this is one of those things that's not really worth weighing in on beyond saying this is happening. Various people have come forward, and it's going to mean you're not going to hear much from Russell Brand in terms of work or movies or entertainment until the facts bear out on this one way or the other. And then lastly, in kind of fun news, Lando. This is a part of Star Wars fiction. Many of you probably are familiar in the original Star Wars movies, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Billy D. Williams played a character called Lando Calrissian, which is a great part of the story and a really fun character. Well, some years back in 2018, there was a movie called Solo, and it was directed by a couple people, and then it was ultimately directed by Ron Howard. And a part of this was that this was kind of like an origin story for Han Solo, and it was also a part of how he first came to know Lando Calrissian. And Childish Gambino, Donald Glover, played the young version of Lando. And at the time when the movie came out, it basically indicated that this was massively important to him to play this character. This is something that really meant a lot to him. He campaigned for it, ultimately got the part. Movie was pretty good for what it's worth. It just wasn't a very big success, and there was some controversy because it was at some point stopped. The directors were removed. Ron Howard came in. There was a very different cut of the movie that ultimately came out, and it didn't do very well for a Star Wars movie, which is to say it still made money more than most movies, but Star Wars movies tend to make billions of dollars. So as time has gone on, there was word announced that Disney was working on a Lando series for Disney Plus. Of course, there's a flood of content and all the shows you've heard us mention: The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett. There was the Obi-Wan show, and now most recently Ahsoka Tano. Well, apparently this show is no longer a show, and it is going to be a movie. And this comes in the wake of news coming from an interview on a podcast called the Pablo Torre Finds Out podcast, where Stephen Glover, Donald Glover's brother, who is a partner of his in the famed show Atlanta that Donald Glover starred in, and apparently is a part of this process of trying to get whatever Lando is made, indicated that it's not even a show. The idea was right now to do a movie. Right now, because of the strike, it's like playing telephone. So this may have evolved into being from an episodic series to a first-run movie. We'll bring you more information as we have more information to provide there. And lastly, for our story today, I wanted to basically talk in regards to our little friend right here you see in camera. This is what's called a Replicade. This is made by a company called New Wave Toys, and this is a series of miniature 1/6 arcades that they make. They're exact replicas of the real thing, and they're even functional, and some of them, like this one, have an HDMI output if you wanted to play it on a big screen television. Now, being a person who came from old school vintage 80s video game era, these things mean a lot to me, and this kind of reminded me this arrived. I'm very happy to play this game. By the way, if you've never played this game, it's abominably hard. It's an incredibly hard game from the era of just like taking quarters from people left, right, and center, but still an amazingly designed, brilliant, beautiful game. Really fun soundtrack, just a really, really, really cute game. And I just wanted to tell a brief story about kind of how I came to these kinds of things. Now, when I was younger and, didn't have any money really, when nothing that my parents didn't give me, I had an allowance. And this was in the time when I had to do chores to have an allowance. And the way that it worked was I had to clean my room, I had to clean the living room, I had to clean my mom's car, and my dad had a game room. I had to clean the game room. And it was awful. That was my Sunday every single week. And for that, which took me all those things, maybe 4 hours on a Sunday on a weekend. I guess I wasn't really doing much on Sundays at that age, thinking between like 8 and 12 or whatever age bracket that was. But for that time, I got paid a whopping $5. Now, this meant the world to me in this phase because all of that effort and all that work meant that every weekend, the arrangement that was had, my mother would take me to this local mall. It was called the Farmington Valley Mall in Connecticut. And at the Farmington Valley Mall, they had one of the few that you could drive to, at least, coin-op arcades. Now, some of you may not know much about the world of video games, but in the 80s, arcades were a very big deal and a very big business. After the explosion of Space Invaders and Pac-Man, everyone everywhere started having arcades. And for a while there, they were kind of one of the main things to do in the 80s. They didn't survive very well in the 90s. Arcades started getting more expensive than 25 cents, and perhaps that drove it down. But also, the proliferation of like high quality console video games was a big part of that. But in this phase, in this era, it was like magic. And a big part of what made it so fun for me, especially, because, I'd go to this arcade in the middle of the Farmington Valley Mall. I'd put the $5 bill that I would get for all of my work into the, token machine. And this particular arcade had a deal where you got 30 tokens for $5. For that commitment to $5, you got more than 4 quarters worth of play. So I would just wander around that room in circles playing every game, going around and doing different things and playing different games. I'd spend as much time watching the game in attract mode, which is what you see happening right here, where it basically would try to bring people in to put their quarter in and play the game. And I would just really try to understand the game and then play it and try a little here and a little there and a little there. And what was so wonderful to me about it was the creativity. It was a big part of what kept me so interested in that phase of my life. I mean, I already liked video games to some extent, but it was all the different things that were being tried. Some games were top down, some games were side scrollers, some games were like Punch Out, Nintendo's old game Punch Out. You saw through the character in the middle of like a simplified boxing match. Then there were games like Ghosts and Goblins here, which were in a fantasy kind of occult horror world. You're fighting demons and visions of the devil and Lucifer. And some of the first really successful games in that era, I remember, were Rolling Thunder, which is kind of a spy game. And then there was Double Dragon, which was, the classic beat 'em up game, which was the first time I ever heard the word boss referred to in a video game as like an end level boss that you fought. And then as things kind of evolved from there, you had Pit Fighter and then Street Fighter and then ultimately Mortal Kombat. But in those years, before anything like that was a major concern, I mean, everything from Marble Madness to Top Gun, Afterburner, and then they also had Rastan, and I mean, the games were unlimited. Such creativity, such ingenuity, and, of course, under the auspices of taking your quarter. But the really great thing about the way games were in those days, I mean, of course, some of those games had more, if you're playing like Frogger or Popeye, not much changed about them. You play the same level or a sped up version of the same level. You're playing Centipede. You're still just shooting little toadstools. But some of these games went on and had long levels and bosses and other complicated things to keep putting quarters in. But most of the time, they were designed to be something you could put in a quarter or two, and then it's it. You go in, you put in a quarter, you move on with your day. You play for 5 or 10 minutes as long as you could, or maybe you play a couple times if you found it to be really engaging. They're meant to be single-serving experiences. The modern age of video games, it's very hard to find anything like that. I mean, there's a brief infatuation with, say, Angry Birds in our world and our culture, and, there was also Flappy Bird, that game that was, taken off the App Store just as it got popular. But generally speaking, most video games that people make are meant to be like serious, committed experiences. You're going to be playing these things for 20 to 30 hours, if not a lot more, with some of the bigger games that come out nowadays. But it was wonderful in its time. People put their quarters on the little slip, the arcade, right by the screen, and that was the order that people could play. And some games were multiplayer, like Rampage or Gauntlet, and then many were just single player. You go and do what you can, and then you go and try something else. In those days, about as much fun as you could have had. It was such a great experience, and makes me very happy in a nostalgic way that this has arrived, because this was kind of my own personal beginning love of, monsters and magic and, kind of those ruminations of fantasy and, all that kind of stuff. This is where it kind of began for me, not really knowing that, not reading a lot of that phase of my life. So we're going to end there, and we'll be back next week. Want to thank you again, wherever you are, however you're seeing me, however you're hearing me, wherever you're engaging with this, whether it's on Spotify, whether it's in YouTube, whether it's a part of our live stream here on Twitch that we do every week, whether it is in the various places we post clips from this in social media, and that's Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or in Tumblr or in YouTube Shorts. Wherever it is you engage with us, thank you so much for joining us. And ultimately, we will be back next week, as we always do. We post these on YouTube the following week, either Tuesday or Wednesday. before each live show on Thursday, and we'll be back next Thursday, roughly 5:30 p.m. Pacific time or 6 o'clock, depending on what it takes to get ready. Sometimes there's a little more prep, sometimes there's a little less. But if you haven't already, please follow us on Twitch. Please subscribe to us on YouTube. Thank you again for joining us. So glad to see you all.